Andrew Jackson defied the Supreme Court twice. Looks to me like Trump is setting this up again. Is America ready for a lawless president? Check it out, ding the bell, leave your comments, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your friends. You've got Donald Trump saying that he's not accountable to the Constitution. That the Democrats, they haven't held a vote in the House of Representatives, so we're going to ignore everything. Well, they're not even saying, he's not even now saying, you know, if they have a vote, I'll cooperate. He's just saying, no, I'm not going to cooperate. We have, and so, you know, what happens when you have a constitutional crisis like this? My understanding of this, and of course we'll ask Congressman Pocan when he comes on in the next hour, but my understanding of how this sort of thing typically plays out is when you have a dispute between the executive branch, the president, and his, you know, in the Department of Justice and whatnot, between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and in this case the House of Representatives, being led by Nancy Pelosi. When you have a dispute between those two branches of government, the agency, as it were, that adjudicates that dispute, that determines, you know, who wins and who loses in that dispute, is the Supreme Court. And in fact, that's what happened in Nixon v. U.S. back in 1974. That's what happened in was it Starr versus Clinton? I forget the exact name of the Supreme Court case. Where Bill Clinton was sued. Maybe it was Jones v. Clinton. By Paula Jones, which kind of started that whole thing, you'll recall. And the Supreme Court said, yes, he can be deposed in a civil lawsuit. And it was in that deposition where Monica Lewinsky was brought up, and he lied about it under oath, and that was what led to his impeachment. But the point is that, you know, the court has intervened in these disputes between the legislative and executive branches twice with regard to impeachment. So let's say that the Democrats go to the Supreme Court and say, you need to tell Trump that he needs to turn over these documents and he needs to allow people who have worked for him to testify before Congress. If it has to do with top secret stuff, we can do it in secret session. But if not, it's going to be in public. You, Supreme Court, need to tell Trump and the executive branch to cooperate with an impeachment inquiry because it is mandated by the Constitution. Now, one of two things could happen. One would be that the Supreme Court, in a purely partisan move, in a 5-4 decision, would say, Trump doesn't have to do that. You haven't yet made a strong enough case. Or maybe even, you know, we now disagree with the way that we ruled in the late 90s. I think it was 98 in Jones v. Clinton, and in 74 in U.S. v. Nixon. We now disagree with our, with our predecessors' decisions, excuse me. They could do that. Or alternatively, they could say, okay, Trump, you got to turn this stuff over and you've got to send your people to testify before Congress. That's our ruling. Now, if the first thing happens, I'm not sure how this plays out. We already have a confession from Trump that he basically said to the president of Ukraine, you give me dirt on Joe Biden, I'll give you weapons to protect yourself against, Russia going beyond Crimea or beyond the Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, where there's, a lot of apparently Russian occupation forces or irregulars anyway. So we've got that. I mean, arguably he could be impeached right now with nothing more. So that would be one way that plays out. But the alternative, the thing that really concerns me, the one that I think we all really need to pay attention to, is if the Supreme Court says to Trump, you have to turn this stuff over, and Trump says no, what then? This has happened 3 times in our history. Twice with Andrew Jackson, once with Abraham Lincoln. In Lincoln's case, the Supreme Court in Dred Scott, Roger Taney was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1856, which was 4 years before Lincoln ran for president, 5 years before he was inaugurated. But nonetheless, in that decision, the Supreme Court said that people of African ancestry, regardless of what state that they were in, were property, not persons. And Abraham Lincoln, when he became president, he said, I'm going to ignore the Supreme Court. But more to the point here is what happened in Andrew Jackson's presidency. Andrew Jackson was a slaveholder. Andrew Jackson was a Southerner. Andrew Jackson is the guy whose picture hangs in Trump's office. Andrew Jackson was the guy who was going to be taken off the $20 bill and replaced by Harriet Tubman, as I recall. And Trump put a stop to that. It's supposed to happen last year, I think. Trump and Mnuchin. But Andrew Jackson most famously is the guy who, when the Supreme Court said, Jackson said, we're going to take all these Cherokees in Georgia and we're going to turn their land over to plantation owners and slaveholders who are going to turn this into plantations and grow cotton. We're going to kick out the Cherokees and we're going to march them all the way over to Oklahoma. When Jackson said he was going to do that, he got sued. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And there's not an actual document that actually quotes Jackson as saying this, but there are numerous people from the time who quoted him saying it, where he said, okay, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. And there is the problem. The Supreme Court has no enforcement mechanism outside of the executive branch. The executive branch is where all the police powers reside. And the one thing that has prevented the executive branch from rising up, that is the president, from a president in the past, from rising up and becoming a dictator, has been, frankly, goodwill, a belief in the American Republic. Back when Franklin Roosevelt was pushing through legislation for his New Deal, he did a few things by executive order, and Republicans were saying, oh my God, he's turning into a dictator. Well, he didn't. He respected the rule of law. The same thing was said about, Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society. The same thing was said, frankly, about George W. Bush and Dick Cheney with their illegal wars and their torture and stuff. But they didn't go so far, arguably, they didn't go so far as to say to Congress, no, you can't have this. Although, the CIA, which is part of the executive branch, did destroy all those videotapes of the torture that the U.S. engaged in that was sanctioned within the Bush White House by Jay Bybee, by John Yoo, and by Brett Kavanaugh, the lawyers who were working for George W. Bush at that time. But if Donald Trump says, no, I'm not going to do what the Supreme Court tells me to do, period, full stop, nya, go ahead and make me, I dare you. If he does that, if he says that, then we've walked off the edge of the cliff for the first time in our history. Jackson's defiance of the Supreme Court didn't have to do with impeachment, didn't have to do with high crimes and misdemeanors. It had to do with relatively small things. The first was the Trail of Tears. The second was the Second National Bank. The Supreme Court said you can't shut the bank down. Jackson went ahead and did it anyway. But these were not things that shook the nation.